April 15th, 1943. 25,000 feet above occupied Belgium, Captain Werner Schroer of Jagdgeschwader 26 watched through his canopy as the American formation approached. His radio crackled to life with his own voice, barely containing his amusement. "The Americans are flying barrels." After 3 years of combat, Schroer had seen everything the British could throw at him. Spitfires, Hurricanes, even the twin-engine Beaufighters. All sleek, all dangerous in their own ways. But these new American fighters approaching his position looked like nothing he'd ever encountered. They were massive, ungainly things with enormous round noses and stubby wings. Compared to his streamlined Focke-Wulf FW-190, these Republic P-47 Thunderbolts appeared more suited to hauling cargo than engaging in aerial combat. Other German pilots joined the conversation, their voices mixing mockery with genuine confusion. How could the Americans send such monsters into combat? Where was the elegance, the speed, the agility that defined a proper fighter aircraft? The P-47 looked like someone had strapped wings to a milk jug and hoped for the best. Its massive radial engine gave it a blunt, brutal appearance that seemed to defy every principle of aerodynamic design the Germans had perfected. In the ready rooms across occupied France, German pilots gathered around recognition charts showing the new American fighter. They laughed. They made jokes. Some questioned whether American industry had lost its mind. The veterans who'd fought since 1939 were confident. They'd mastered the Spitfire's tricks. They'd learned to respect the heavy firepower of the Hurricane. But this bloated American newcomer? It would be target practice. What those German pilots didn't know, couldn't know, in that spring of 1943 was that they were looking at the aircraft that would break the Luftwaffe's back. Within months, the laughter would die in their throats, replaced by cautious respect, then genuine fear. Those 8.5 caliber machine guns in the P-47's wings would rain devastation that German pilots had never experienced. That massive radial engine would prove nearly indestructible, bringing pilots home through damage that would have destroyed any other fighter. And that bulk they mocked would translate into dive speeds that could outrun anything the Luftwaffe possessed. By war's end, German pilots would speak of the P-47 not with derision, but with something approaching awe. Captured Luftwaffe officers would admit that the Thunderbolt represented a form of warfare they'd never imagined possible. American industrial might, packaged in a flying tank that absorbed punishment and delivered devastation in equal measure. This is the story of how German pilots learned to fear the P-47 Thunderbolt. It's the story of 8.5 caliber machine guns that changed air warfare forever. And it's the story of American pilots who proved that in combat, survivability and firepower matter more than elegance and grace. The story begins not in the skies over Europe, but in a design office in Farmingdale, New York, where a Georgian immigrant named Alexander Kartveli was about to revolutionize fighter design. Alexander Kartveli hunched over his drafting table in the Republic Aviation offices, wrestling with an impossible problem. The United States Army Air Corps wanted a fighter that could dominate at high altitude, something that could escort bombers deep into enemy territory and engage German fighters on equal terms. But high-altitude performance required enormous power, and power meant weight, and weight was the enemy of everything a fighter aircraft was supposed to be. Kartveli knew fighters. Born in Tiflis, Georgia, in 1919, he'd fled the Bolshevik Revolution and made his way to France, then eventually to America. He'd worked with Alexander Devastation on the P-35, one of America's first all-metal fighters, but this new challenge was different. This wasn't about creating a sleek interceptor. This was about building a fighter that could breathe at altitudes where other aircraft gasped for air. The key was the engine. In 1940, Pratt Whitney unveiled the R-2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine that produced an astounding 2,000 horsepower. It was a monster, weighing over 2,300 pounds and measuring nearly 4 feet in diameter. Most designers would have looked at that massive engine and walked away. Kartveli looked at it and saw possibility. But raw power wasn't enough. At 30,000 feet, the thin air strangled conventional engines. What Kartveli needed was forced induction, a way to cram enough air into the engine to maintain power at extreme altitudes.
Kartveli made a radical decision. Instead of trying to minimize the turbo supercharger or hide it somewhere, he would design the entire aircraft around it. The turbo supercharger would sit in the rear fuselage, connected to the engine by a complex system of ducting. Air would enter through a massive intake under the engine, travel back to the turbo supercharger, get compressed and cooled, then return to the engine under pressure. It was brilliant engineering, but it created a massive aircraft. The P-47 would be the largest single-seat fighter ever built, weighing over 10,000 pounds empty and approaching 18,000 pounds fully loaded. For comparison, the Supermarine Spitfire weighed about 5,000 pounds empty. The P-47 would be more than 3 times heavier than the graceful British fighter that had won the Battle of Britain. Republic Aviation submitted the proposal in June 1940. The Army Air Corps studied the drawings, considered the radical design, and in September ordered a prototype. The XP-47B would either validate Kartveli's revolutionary approach or prove that heavy fighters were a dead end. Development was anything but smooth. The first prototype didn't fly until May 6, 1941. Test pilot Lowry Bradham lifted off from Republic's Farmingdale facility and immediately encountered problems. The canopy wouldn't open at high altitude, control forces were excessive, the massive propeller created torque that made takeoff a wrestling match. Worst of all, the complex turbo supercharger system proved temperamentally unreliable. Engineers worked around the clock addressing issues. They developed a sliding bubble canopy to replace the hinged door. They added trim tabs and adjusted control surfaces to reduce the enormous forces required to maneuver the aircraft. They refined the turbo supercharger ducting, slowly coaxing reliability from the complex system. But when everything worked, the XP-47B was magnificent. It could reach 412 miles per hour in level flight, making it one of the fastest aircraft in the world. More impressively, it could maintain that performance at 30,000 feet, an altitude where most fighters were gasping. And it could dive like nothing else in the sky, the massive weight and powerful engine allowing it to accelerate past 500 miles per hour in a steep descent. The Army Air Corps was impressed enough to order 171 production P-47Bs in March 1942. By summer, improved P-47Cs were rolling off the assembly line, and Republic was ramping up for mass production. They opened a second factory in Evansville, Indiana, and licensed production to Curtiss Wright in Buffalo, New York. But nobody really knew if the massive fighter would work in combat. It defied every convention of fighter design. Instead of light and agile, it was heavy and powerful. Instead of minimizing weight, it carried armor plate around the cockpit and self-sealing fuel tanks. Instead of 4 machine guns, it carried 8 .5 caliber weapons with 3,400 rounds of ammunition. The test would come in England, where the first P-47 groups began arriving in late 1942. The 56th Fighter Group, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke, received brand new P-47Cs. Zemke was a no-nonsense leader who'd flown observation aircraft in Russia before the war. He understood the Luftwaffe's capabilities, and he knew his pilots would be facing the best fighter pilots in the world. What Zemke didn't know was whether the P-47 could compete with the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf FW-190 that dominated European skies. On paper, the numbers looked concerning. The Bf-109 could climb faster at low altitude, the FW-190 could turn tighter. Both German fighters had experienced pilots who'd been fighting since 1939. But Zemke had faith in American engineering and American pilots. He developed training programs focused on the P-47's strengths. Use altitude, use speed, never try to turn with a German fighter. Instead, dive on them from above, use the incredible firepower to destroy the target, and zoom back to altitude using the P-47's superior high-altitude performance. It was sound theory. Whether it would work in the lethal skies over occupied Europe remained to be seen. The 56th Fighter Group was about to find out, and so were the laughing German pilots who thought they'd be facing easy targets. The 8 Browning M2.5 caliber machine guns represented the most concentrated firepower ever installed in a single-seat fighter aircraft. 4 guns in each wing, staggered to fit within the wing structure, ammunition boxes feeding from inside the wing through flexible chutes, brass ejection chutes dumping spent casings overboard, electric heating elements to prevent the guns from freezing at high altitude. The entire system weighed over 2,000 pounds fully loaded, but that weight bought devastating firepower. Pilots loved the guns. They were reliable, rarely jamming, even in the extreme conditions of high-altitude combat. They were accurate, the heavy bullets retaining energy at longer ranges than lighter rifle-caliber weapons, and they were numerous enough that even if 1 or 2 guns malfunctioned, the P-47 still had overwhelming firepower. The convergence point at 300 yards was carefully calculated. At that range, all 8 streams of bullets would intercept at a single point, creating a killing zone where any aircraft would be shredded. Pilots learned to judge the distance, waiting for the target to grow in their gun sight until it filled the sight ring, then pressing the trigger and watching the target disintegrate. German aircraft were not designed to withstand that kind of punishment. The Bf-109, elegant and nimble, had thin aluminum skin that .5 caliber rounds punched through like paper. The FW-190, more robust with radial engine protection, was still vulnerable to the concentrated fire. Even a short burst could sever control cables, knock out the engine, or set the fuel tanks ablaze. But the gun's effectiveness extended beyond air combat. When P-47s transitioned to ground attack missions, those 8.5 caliber machine guns became devastating anti-vehicle weapons. Armor-piercing rounds could penetrate the thin top armor of German tanks and armored vehicles. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds set trucks and railroad cars ablaze. Against soft targets, like troop columns and supply dumps, the firepower was devastating. A fully loaded P-47 carried approximately 600 pounds of ammunition. When that ammunition was expended on a strafing run, it represented an enormous transfer of kinetic energy to the target. Pilots would roll in on a convoy or column, point the nose at the target, and hold the trigger. The 8 streams of tracers looked like death itself, arcing down to tear through metal and flesh. The psychological effect was immense. German soldiers learned to fear the distinctive sound of a P-47's guns. The high-pitched buzzsaw noise as 8 machine guns fired simultaneously was unmistakable. When they heard it, experienced soldiers dove for cover, knowing that whatever the P-47 was shooting at was about to cease to exist. Ground attack accuracy was enhanced by a simple gyroscopic gun sight that computed the correct lead angle for moving targets. The pilot just needed to keep the pipper on the target and squeeze the trigger. The gun sight did the math, calculating bullet drop and lead angle based on airspeed and dive angle. Ammunition management became an art form. Pilots learned to fire in controlled bursts rather than holding the trigger down. They learned to judge how much ammunition remained by the feel of the trigger and the sound of the guns. They learned which targets deserved a long burst and which could be destroyed with a short squeeze. Some pilots claimed they could feel the aircraft accelerate when they stopped firing, the drag from the 8 machine guns noticeable enough to affect flight performance. Whether this was real or imagined, It spoke to the enormous air resistance created by 8 barrels protruding into the slipstream. Maintenance crews worked constantly to keep the guns operational. Between missions, armorers would pull to guns, clean them, inspect for wear, and reload the ammunition boxes. It was a time-consuming process, but absolutely critical. A P-47 with malfunctioning guns was just a flying target. The reliability of the Browning M2 machine gun was legendary. Designed by John Browning in the 1920s, it was a mature, proven weapon system. In the harsh environment of aerial combat, freezing at altitude, heating during prolonged fire, vibration from maneuvering, the M2 just kept working. Jam rates were remarkably low, especially compared to the more complex cannon systems used by other nations. German pilots who survived encounters with P-47s consistently reported being stunned by the volume of fire. They were accustomed to seeing a few tracer rounds from enemy fighters. Against a P-47, the sky filled with tracers. The noise was overwhelming. The impact on their aircraft was catastrophic. Luftwaffe ace Heinz Baer, who survived the war with 220 victories, was shot up by a P-47 and barely made it back to base. His FW-190 had more than 40 hits from .50 caliber rounds. He reported that it felt like flying through a metal storm. He said the P-47 could absorb an astounding amount of lead and had to be handled very carefully. But he could have added that it also dispensed an astounding amount of lead. The gun camera footage from P-47s shows the devastating effect clearly. A burst hitting a Bf-109's fuselage would tear huge chunks of metal away. Hits on the wing would cause it to fold or separate. Hits on the engine would cause immediate catastrophic failure, with smoke pouring from the cowling, followed by flames. And in many cases, the fuel tank would explode, the aircraft disintegrating in a fireball. By late 1943, Luftwaffe pilots understood that if a P-47 got its guns lined up, the fight was over. The sheer concentration of firepower meant there was no surviving a sustained burst. The only option was not to get hit, which meant never letting the P-47 get into firing position. This changed the dynamic of air combat over Europe. German fighters that once pressed attacks aggressively now broke off earlier. They'd make one pass and then disengage, unwilling to risk a prolonged engagement where the P-47's firepower could be brought to bear. This defensive posture meant bomber formations went unharassed, exactly what the P-47 was designed to achieve. The 8.50 caliber machine guns weren't just weapons. They were a statement of American manufacturing capability and design philosophy. Where other nations economized, trying to achieve effect with minimum weight, America loaded maximum firepower and let the powerful engine compensate. It was an approach that German pilots initially dismissed, then learned to respect, and finally learned to fear. Those 8 guns, firing in unison, created a cone of destruction 300 yards long and several feet wide. Anything entering that cone was doomed. And as German pilots discovered throughout 1943 and 1944, getting into firing range of the P-47 was the last mistake many of them ever made. April 8, 1943. RAF Horsham St. Faith, Norfolk, England. The 56th Fighter Group prepared for its first combat mission. Pilots climbed into their P-47Cs, settling into the comfortable cockpits that someone had compared to flying a lounge chair. Ground crews gave final checks, ensuring the 8 machine guns were loaded and the massive Pratt Whitney engine was running smoothly. Lieutenant Robert Johnson strapped into his P-47, nicknamed Half Pint. At 23 years old, Johnson was about to experience combat for the first time. He'd been flying the P-47 for months, learning its quirks and capabilities. But training flights over England were nothing like facing experienced Luftwaffe pilots over occupied Europe. The mission was a fighter sweep over France, designed to provoke the Germans into combat and give the green American pilots their first taste of aerial warfare. 14 P-47s took off, joined by 12 Spitfires from the RAF. The British pilots, veterans with years of combat experience, were along to provide backup if things went wrong. They climbed to 30,000 feet, where the P-47's turbo-supercharged engine breathed easily while the Spitfire struggled. This was the Thunderbolt's realm, the high-altitude environment where its design advantages became apparent. Below, the French coast slid past, green fields and gray cities under the morning sun. The Germans didn't rise to the bait. The Luftwaffe pilots had learned caution fighting the RAF, and they weren't going to waste fuel and pilots testing these unknown American fighters. The P-47s flew their sweep and returned to England without firing a shot. Johnson felt both relief and disappointment.
He'd geared himself up for combat and gotten a sightseeing tour instead. But the missions would come. Over the next few weeks, the 56 Fighter Group flew escort missions for bombers striking targets in France and the Low Countries. They learned navigation, radio procedures, and formation flying under combat conditions. They learned to scan the sky constantly, knowing that the first warning of an attack might be tracer rounds flashing past the canopy. On April 15th, the Luftwaffe finally engaged. Captain Don Blaxley of the 4th Fighter Group, flying his P-47 on a bomber escort, spotted a Focke-Wulf FW-190 below him. Blaxley rolled inverted and pulled into a dive, the P-47 accelerating rapidly as gravity and 2,000 horsepower combined. The FW-190 pilot never saw him coming. Blaxley lined up behind the German fighter, closing to 300 yards, and pressed the trigger. 8.50 caliber machine guns erupted, sending a stream of tracers into the FW-190. Hits sparkled across the fuselage. Smoke poured from the engine. The FW-190 rolled over and dove, trailing fire. Blaxley pulled out of his dive and climbed back to altitude, his first victory with the P-47 recorded. But Blaxley's reaction was less than enthusiastic. The P-47 was heavy, ungainly at low altitude, and nothing like the nimble Spitfires he'd flown with the RAF's Eagle Squadron. He reportedly said, "It ought to dive, it sure can't climb." Other pilots shared his skepticism. The P-47 seemed like a truck compared to the sports car they wanted to fly.
The early missions revealed teething problems. Pratt Whitney's R-2800 engines suffered ignition failures at high altitude, spark plugs fouled, distributors leaked. Planes would abort missions with engines running rough, limping back to base with cylinders misfiring. Other times, engines would quit completely, forcing pilots to glide back across the channel, hoping to reach England before ditching in the cold water. Mechanical reliability wasn't the only issue. The P-47's size and weight made it challenging to fly. Torque from the massive propeller tried to roll the aircraft on takeoff. The long nose blocked forward visibility on the ground, requiring crew chiefs to sit on the wing and give hand signals during taxiing. The controls were heavy, requiring significant strength to maneuver in combat. German pilots watched these early missions and refined their assessments. Yes, the P-47 was fast in a dive. Yes, it had impressive firepower. But it was slow to accelerate, climbed poorly at low altitude, and couldn't turn with the Bf-109 or FW-190. Experienced Luftwaffe pilots developed tactics exploiting these weaknesses. Don't dive away from a P-47, it will catch you. Instead, turn hard and climb. The heavy American fighter can't follow. These tactics worked. P-47s returned from missions with battle damage, and pilots reported being outmaneuvered by German fighters. Some P-47s didn't return at all, shot down by more agile opponents. The loss rate wasn't catastrophic, but it wasn't good either. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke, commanding the 56 Fighter Group, recognized the problem. His pilots were trying to fight the P-47 like a Spitfire, mixing it up and turning dogfights at medium altitude. That played to the German fighter's strengths and negated the P-47's advantages. Zemke drilled new tactics into his pilots. Stay at altitude. Use the turbo supercharger's advantage. When you spot German fighters below, dive on them, make one firing pass, and zoom back to altitude. Don't dogfight. Don't chase them down to the deck. Use speed and altitude, not maneuverability. It was a revolutionary approach to fighter combat. For years, the image of air combat had been turning dogfights, fighters spiraling around each other in aerial ballet. Zemke was teaching his pilots to be predators, not dancers. Strike from above, strike hard, disengage before the enemy can react. But changing ingrained habits was difficult. Pilots who'd training for dogfighting wanted to dogfight. When a German fighter appeared below them, the instinct was to follow it down and engage in a turning battle. Zemke had to break that instinct, convince his pilots that boom and zoom tactics weren't cowardice, but superior tactics. The breakthrough came in May and June 1943. Pilots who followed Zemke's guidance started racking up victories. They'd climb to 30,000 feet, patrol above the bomber formations, and when German fighters appeared below, they'd roll inverted and dive. The P-47 would accelerate to 500 miles per hour or more. The pilot would line up his target, fire a burst from 300 yards, and pull up in a steep zoom climb that carried him back to altitude. The German pilot would be at 15,000 feet, straining to climb back up.
The P-47 pilot would arrive back at 30,000 feet, loop over, and be ready for another diving attack. Meanwhile, the German pilot would be at 15,000 feet, straining to climb back up. Robert Johnson scored his first victory on June 13, 1943, shooting down an FW-190 exactly as Zemke had taught. Robert Johnson rolled into a dive from altitude, accelerated to over 400 miles per hour, closed to firing range, and pressed the trigger. His .850 caliber guns shredded the FW-190. Johnson pulled up into a zoom climb, watching the German fighter spin down in flames. But 13 days later, Johnson nearly died. His experience would become the most famous demonstration of the P-47 survivability and would shake German confidence in their ability to defeat the new American fighter. June 26, 1943. The 56 Fighter Group launched 48 P-47Cs from RAF Manston to escort B-17 bombers returning from a strike against Villers-Coublay airfield near Paris. Johnson flew at the rear of the 61st Squadron's formation, following his element leader through broken clouds at 24,000 feet. Without warning, 16 Focke-Wulf FW-190s from Jagdgeschwader 26 dove from above and behind. The Germans had climbed into the sun and positioned themselves perfectly for a bounce. The first German pilot fired, and tracers streaked past Johnson's canopy. Johnson tried to brake, tried to turn into the attack, but he was a split second too slow. The FW-190's 20mm cannon found their mark. 21 cannon shells hit Johnson's P-47 in rapid succession, hammering the fuselage like sledgehammers. The canopy shattered, spraying Johnson with plexiglass fragments. A cannon shell exploded in his cockpit, peppering his face and hands with shrapnel. Machine gun rounds stitched across the fuselage, severing hydraulic lines and control tables. The P-47 snapped into a violent spin. Johnson fought the controls as the aircraft tumbled toward the earth, spinning faster and faster. The engine howled, the airframe groaned. Everything loose in the cockpit flew around him. Blood from his wounds splattered across the instrument panel. Through force of will and desperate control inputs, Johnson managed to stop the spin. The P-47 was flying again. Sort of. The hydraulics were gone, meaning no flaps, no landing gear control. The canopy was jammed shut. The rudder pedals felt mushy, the control cables partially severed. The engine was running, but rough, with at least one cylinder misfiring. Johnson assessed his options. He was over occupied France with a badly damaged aircraft. Bail out and spend the war in a prison camp? Try to make it to Spain and internment? Or attempt to nurse the crippled P-47 back to England? He chose England. Johnson turned west, flying as low as he dared to avoid radar detection. The French coast passed beneath him. Then he was over the English Channel, 60 miles of cold water between him and safety. That's when the FW-190 appeared. The German pilot pulled alongside, close enough that Johnson could see his face. The German pilot studied the shattered FW-190, clearly amazed it was still flying. Then he positioned himself behind and slightly above Johnson's crippled fighter. Johnson was defenseless. The controls were so damaged he could barely keep the aircraft level, much less maneuver. If the German pilot chose to finish him, there was nothing Johnson could do. The German pilot fired. Cannon shells and machine gun rounds hammered Johnson's P-47. The fuselage shuddered with impact after impact. Johnson counted the hits, each one a death sentence that somehow didn't kill him. The armor plate behind his seat stopped rounds that would have gone through his body. The radial engine's robust construction absorbed hits that would have destroyed a liquid-cooled inline engine. The German pilot made another pass. More hits. The tail was shredded. More holes appeared in the wings. How the P-47 was still flying was beyond comprehension. It violated everything Johnson knew about aircraft structural limits. A third pass.
The German pilot was using all his remaining ammunition, determined to bring down this impossible American fighter. Johnson could only sit there, hands locked on the controls, watching tracer rounds flash past and feeling the impacts as shells hit home. Then, silence. The FW-190 pulled alongside again. The German pilot stared at the P-47, shaking his head. He looked at Johnson, made eye contact. Then he rocked his wings in salute and turned away, flying back toward France. Later analysis suggested the German pilot was likely Oberstleutnant Egon Meyer, a 102 victory ace and expert in aerial combat. Meyer had expended all his ammunition on Johnson's P-47 and was probably stunned that the aircraft was still flying. The wing salute might have been respect or disbelief, or both. Johnson coaxed his dying P-47 across the channel. The engine was overheating, control response was getting worse, but the sturdy aircraft held together. The English coast appeared through the shattered windscreen. Johnson radioed for emergency landing clearance and lined up on the runway at RAF Manston. Landing was almost impossible. No hydraulics meant no flaps, so the approach speed was higher than normal. The damaged control surfaces made it difficult to maintain heading. Johnson used every bit of his training and no small amount of luck to get the P-47 on the ground. The aircraft rolled to a stop. Johnson sat there for a moment, hardly believing he was alive. Then he unbuckled, forced open the jammed canopy, and climbed out. His legs nearly gave out. He dropped to his knees and kissed the English soil. Ground crew and mechanics swarmed the aircraft. They counted over 200 bullet and cannon holes. The tail was in tatters. Control cables were hanging by threads. The engine had taken multiple hits but kept running. The self-sealing fuel tanks had been punctured but sealed themselves, preventing fire. The armor plate had stopped rounds that would have killed Johnson. One mechanic summed it up. "Lieutenant, this airplane saved your life." Word of Johnson's survival spread through both American and German forces. American pilots gained confidence in their aircraft's survivability. If a P-47 could take that kind of punishment and bring its pilot home, they could be aggressive in combat without fear that one hit would doom them. German pilots drew different conclusions. They'd seen Egon Meyer, one of their best, shoot a P-47 to pieces with 20mm cannon fire, and the American fighter had survived. How were they supposed to defeat these aircraft? The amount of damage required to bring down a P-47 was staggering. Johnson's battered fighter was deemed beyond repair and scrapped on the spot. But Robert Johnson was back in combat within days, flying a new P-47 he nicknamed Lucky. Over the next 10 months, he would shoot down 27 German aircraft, making him one of the top American aces in Europe. And he would always credit the P-47's rugged construction with saving his life. The lesson was clear. The P-47 Thunderbolt wasn't going to win fights through agility or elegance. It was going to win through survivability and overwhelming firepower. German pilots who'd laughed at the bulky American fighter in April 1943 weren't laughing anymore by July. They were watching their best pilots expend all their ammunition on P-47s that refused to go down. They were seeing American fighters dive away at speeds they couldn't match. They were being shot out of the sky by concentrated .50 caliber fire. The turning point had arrived. From this moment forward, German confidence in their air superiority began to erode, and the P-47 Thunderbolt, that ungainly flying barrel, began its transformation into one of the most feared fighters in the European sky. By autumn 1943, the 56th Fighter Group had refined its tactics to a deadly science. The key was altitude and energy management. Fighter pilots talked about energy states, the combination of altitude and airspeed that determined what maneuvers an aircraft could perform. The P-47's massive engine and excellent high-altitude performance gave it an energy advantage that skilled pilots could exploit mercilessly. A typical mission began with a climb to 30,000 feet or higher. At that altitude, the turbo supercharger's efficiency gave the P-47 a decisive edge. German fighters struggled to climb above 28,000 feet with full combat power. The Bf-109 and FW-190 both suffered reduced performance as air density decreased, but the P-47's turbo supercharger compressed the thin air, maintaining engine power at altitudes where German fighters gasped. From that altitude advantage, P-47 pilots could see everything below them. Bomber formations looked like tiny specks. German fighters climbing to intercept appeared as contrails far below. The P-47 pilots would position themselves up-sun, where the glare made them invisible to pilots below. When German fighters approached the bombers, the P-47s would roll inverted and pull into a dive. Gravity and 2,000 horsepower accelerated the heavy fighter rapidly.
Within seconds, airspeed would climb past 400 miles per hour. By the time they reached firing range, P-47s were often exceeding 500 miles per hour. At those speeds, nothing could evade. German pilots would look up and see a P-47 diving on them. They'd try to brake, try to turn, but at 500 miles per hour, the P-47 closed the distance in heartbeats. The American pilot would fire a burst, watch his tracers converge on the target, and see pieces fly off the German fighter. Then came the zoom climb. The P-47 pilot would pull back on the stick, trading that enormous speed for altitude. The aircraft would climb like an elevator, soaring back up to 30,000 feet or beyond. German fighters trying to follow would run out of energy around 20,000 feet, stalling out while the P-47 continued climbing. This boom and zoom tactic required discipline. Young pilots seeing a crippled German fighter limping away would want to follow it down and finish it off, but that meant descending to lower altitude where German fighters had the advantage. Veterans knew better. Make one pass, destroy or damage the target, then zoom back to altitude. Don't chase, don't dogfight. Stay fast and stay high.
The tactics were codified in training. Never turn with a German fighter at low altitude. Never slow down in a combat zone. Always maintain an IFF. Bounced from above, don't try to turn fight. Dive away at full throttle, using the P-47's superior dive speed to break contact. Once clear, climb back to altitude and re-engage on your terms. German pilots adapted their tactics in response. They learned not to dive away from P-47s since the American fighters could catch them. They learned that turning into a diving P-47 might force an overshoot. They learned that fighting at low altitude gave them an advantage if they could force the P-47 down there. But adapting tactics couldn't overcome fundamental performance differences. The P-47 at high altitude had more power, more speed, and more energy than any German fighter. German pilots might be more experienced, might fly more nimble aircraft, but they couldn't overcome physics. The arrival of improved P-47D models in early 1944 made the situation worse for the Luftwaffe. The new models featured paddle blade propellers that increased climb rate by 40%. Suddenly, the P-47's weakness in low-altitude climb performance was largely eliminated. German pilots who'd been evading P-47s by climbing away found the Americans could now follow them up. The P-47D also introduced water injection, a system that injected water-methanol mixture into the engine for emergency power boosts. When activated, the engine developed an additional 800 horsepower for short periods. Pilots called it war emergency power, and it turned the P-47 into a rocket. Activate water injection during a dive and the P-47 would accelerate past 550 miles per hour. Activate it during a climb, and the fighter would soar upward at rates that astonished German pilots. The bubble canopy introduced on later P-47D models eliminated another German advantage. Early P-47s had a framed canopy with limited rearward visibility. German fighters could sneak up from behind and get close before being spotted. The bubble canopy provided 360-degree visibility. P-47 pilots could see attacks developing from any angle and maneuver to counter them. Combat results reflected these advantages. By early 1944, the 56th Fighter Group's kill ratio exceeded 8-1. For every P-47 lost in air combat, they were shooting down 8 or more German fighters. Other P-47 groups showed similar results. The Luftwaffe was hemorrhaging experienced pilots, and the Americans were gaining experience with every mission. German pilots began avoiding contact when possible. Jagdgeschwader 26, one of the Luftwaffe's elite units, issued tactical guidance. Do not engage P-47s at high altitude. If engaged, dive immediately to low altitude where the P-47's performance suffers. Do not attempt to climb away. Brake hard into any attack and try to force an overshoot. But defensive tactics couldn't protect bomber formations from attack. That was the Luftwaffe's primary mission,
to stop American bombers from destroying German industry. If German fighters spent all their time evading P-47s, the bombers got through unharmed. The strategic situation was impossible for the Luftwaffe. They had to attack bombers, which meant climbing to altitude where P-47s dominated. They had to maintain formation while approaching bombers, which made them vulnerable to diving attacks. And they had to press through the P-47 escort to reach the bombers, accepting heavy losses in the process. American fighter pilots exploited this impossible situation ruthlessly. They'd position themselves between the German fighters and the bombers. When Germans tried to attack the bombers, they'd have to fight through the P-47s first. Most never made it. Those that did were often damaged and low on ammunition by the time they reached the bomber formations. The air war over Europe became a battle of attrition, and attrition favored the side with more aircraft and more pilots. America was producing P-47s at an astonishing rate. Republic Aviation's factories were turning out 350 aircraft per month by early 1944. Curtiss Wright added another 80 monthly. The Evansville plant contributed 125 per month. Nearly 600 new P-47s were entering service every month. Germany couldn't match that production rate. Their entire fighter production, all types combined, was about 1,000 aircraft monthly. And they were fighting on multiple fronts, defending against American daylight bombing and British night bombing, while also supporting ground forces in Russia and Italy. Pilot training favored America as well. American pilots received hundreds of hours of instruction before entering combat. They learned navigation, gunnery, formation flying, and tactics in controlled environments where mistakes didn't mean death. German pilot training was being compressed as losses mounted. By 1944, new German pilots were entering combat with 100 hours or less of flight time, barely enough to take off and land safely. The experienced German pilots recognized what was happening. They were fighting American pilots who knew their aircraft's capabilities and had been trained in tactics specifically designed for the P-47. They were outnumbered, often 3-1, and they were operating from bases that themselves were targets for American bombers. Major Josef Priller, a German ace with 101 victories, commented after the war that the P-47 was the perfect fighter-bomber. He noted its guns never jammed, never overheated, and it could absorb damage that would destroy any German fighter. Coming from a German pilot who'd fought from 1939 to 1945, that was high praise indeed. The kill ratio told the story. P-47 units achieved a 4.6-to-1 victory-to-loss ratio over the course of the war. In some periods, particularly mid-1944, the ratio exceeded 8-to-1. German fighters were being destroyed at a rate the Luftwaffe couldn't sustain. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, German fighter strength over Western Europe had been broken. The Luftwaffe could muster only scattered resistance to the invasion. Where thousands of German fighters should have been attacking the invasion fleet, only dozens appeared, and those that did were quickly engaged and destroyed by the waiting P-47s and other Allied fighters. The tactical evolution of the P-47 from heavy, clumsy escort fighter to dominant air superiority platform was complete. German pilots who'd laughed at the aircraft 14 months earlier were avoiding combat with P-47s whenever possible. The boom and zoom tactics pioneered by the 56th Fighter Group had been adopted by all P-47 units. The aircraft's strengths were being exploited, its weaknesses mitigated through superior tactics. And the air war over Europe was being won, mission by mission, combat by combat, by the ungainly fighter that German pilots had initially dismissed as flying barrels. The primary mission of FI-8 Fighter Command was protecting bombers. From early 1943 through mid-1944, American B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators were conducting a strategic bombing campaign against German industry. Without fighter escort, the bombers suffered catastrophic losses. With effective escort, they could reach any target in Germany and return safely. The P-47 became the guardian of those bomber formations, and in doing so, fundamentally changed the strategic situation in Europe.
Before the P-47 arrived in strength, German fighters had been slaughtering bomber formations. The numbers were stark. On missions to Germany without fighter escort, losses often exceeded 10% of the attacking force. On some raids, 20% or more of the bombers failed to return. At that attrition rate, bomber crews faced a mathematical certainty of being shot down before completing their 25-mission tour. The P-47 changed the equation. When Thunderbolts escorted bomber formations, losses dropped to 2 or 3%. On missions with strong fighter escort, entire bomber groups would return without a single loss. The difference was dramatic and immediate. Colonel Hubert Zemke's 56th Fighter Group specialized in bomber escort. Their tactics were refined through hard experience. The group would rendezvous with bomber formations over England, then climb with them to operational altitude. As the formation crossed into occupied territory, the P-47s would position themselves above and to the sides of the bombers, flying a weaving pattern that allowed them to maintain position while constantly scanning for threats. German fighters had to approach the bombers to attack them. That approach exposed them to the P-47s. The Thunderbolt pilots would spot incoming German fighters and dive to intercept. A brief, violent engagement would ensue. Often, the German fighters would be destroyed or damaged before they reached the bombers. Those that got through were harassed by other P-47s, making accurate attacks difficult. The bomber crews loved their P-47 escorts. They could see the distinctive thick-bodied fighters above them weaving back and forth, and they knew they were protected. When German fighters appeared, they'd watch the P-47s peel off and dive, then see smoke trails as German aircraft went down. Radio discipline during escorts was critical. Fighter pilots would call out threats, bandits 2 o'clock high coming in. The lead bomber would acknowledge and the formation would tighten up. The P-47s would move to intercept. Within minutes, the crisis would pass, the German fighters driven off or destroyed. Range was the limiting factor. Early P-47s had combat radius of about 230 miles. That allowed them to escort bombers partway into Germany, but not all the way to targets like Berlin or southern Germany. Bomber crews heading deep into Germany would have P-47 escort for the first leg of the mission, then fly unescorted to the target and back until meeting the P-47s again on the return leg. This created a gap, a period where bombers were vulnerable. German fighters learned to exploit that gap. They'd wait until the P-47s turned back, then swarm the unescorted bombers. The slaughter would continue until the P-47s could reach them on the return leg. American engineers worked frantically to extend the P-47's range. They developed drop tanks that could be attached under the wings and fuselage. These disposable tanks carried extra fuel, then could be jettisoned when empty or when combat was imminent. A P-47 with 2 150-gallon drop tanks could reach targets 375 miles from base. By early 1944, improved drop tank designs and internal fuel capacity increases extended combat radius to over 450 miles. Suddenly, P-47s could escort bombers deep into Germany. The safe zone the Luftwaffe had been exploiting disappeared. American fighters could now reach any target the bombers could reach. The impact was immediate. German fighter losses in early 1944 skyrocketed. They were now facing American fighters throughout entire missions, from the moment bombers entered occupied territory until they returned to England. There was no safe period where they could attack without opposition. On some missions, the escort was so effective that German fighters never reached the bombers at all. The P-47s would intercept every German formation, destroying or scattering them before they could mount coordinated attacks. Bomber crews would fly entire missions to Germany and back without seeing a single enemy aircraft at close range. March 6, 1944 illustrated the P-47's effectiveness. The mission targeted Berlin, the first American daylight raid on the German capital. 800 bombers struck the city, escorted by nearly 900 fighters, including 289 P-47s.
German fighters rose to defend the capital, throwing everything they had at the American formation. The air battle was enormous. Over 70 German aircraft were destroyed, many by P-47s from the 56 Fighter Group. Robert Johnson shot down 2 Bf-109s. Walker Maucheren destroyed 3 FW-190s. Hub Zemke added 2 more to his tally. The 56th alone claimed 15 victories that day. Meanwhile, the bombers completed their attack and returned to England with acceptable losses. The psychological impact on German defenders was profound. If Berlin itself wasn't safe from American bombers, if the Luftwaffe couldn't prevent raids on the capital even when throwing maximum force into the defense, what was the point of continuing the fight? Bomber crews developed confidence that translated into mission effectiveness. Instead of being preoccupied with defending themselves, they could focus on accurate bombing. Formation discipline improved. Navigation became more precise. Bomb scores increased because crews weren't frantically evading fighters during the bomb run. The top-scoring P-47 group was the 56th, which ended the war with over 1,000 aerial victories. But other groups weren't far behind. The 4th Fighter Group added another 550 victories. The 78th Fighter Group contributed 350 more. Across all P-47 units in Europe, over 3,700 German aircraft were destroyed in air-to-air combat. These weren't just numbers on paper. Each victory represented a German pilot who wouldn't threaten bombers anymore. Each successful escort mission meant a target destroyed and bombers returning safely to fly again the next day. The strategic bombing campaign's success depended on fighter escort, and the P-47 provided that escort when it mattered most. Bomber crewmen would see the P-47s and know they had a fighting chance. The German fighters were still deadly, still brave, still skillful, but the P-47 pilots were equally brave and increasingly skillful, flying an aircraft that could match anything the Luftwaffe fielded. The bombers got through, the targets were destroyed, and slowly, inexorably, German industrial capacity was being ground down. By May 1944, the Luftwaffe had largely been cleared from the skies over Western Europe during daylight hours. The P-47 and other American fighters had achieved air superiority. German fighters still existed, still fought, but they were outnumbered, outfought, and unable to prevent the bomber offensive. The guardian role the P-47 played in this achievement cannot be overstated. Without effective fighter escort, strategic bombing would have failed. Without the P-47's combination of range, firepower, and survivability, effective escort would have been impossible. The Thunderbolt did its job, protecting the bombers that were destroying Germany's ability to wage war. And the bomber crews never forgot. After the war, many bomber veterans said their lives were saved by P-47 pilots. They'd seen German fighters diving on their formation, then watched P-47s intercept and destroy the attackers. They'd heard radio calls from their fighter escorts, calm and professional, reporting threats and engagements. They'd landed safely in England after harrowing missions deep into Germany, knowing they owed their survival to the men flying the thick-bodied fighters with 8.50 caliber machine guns. While the P-47 was achieving air superiority, American commanders recognized another need. German ground forces needed to be attacked as well. The Wehrmacht's tanks, trucks, trains, and troop concentrations were legitimate targets. If fighters could disrupt German logistics and mobility, the Allied ground advance would face less resistance. The P-47 was ideally suited for ground attack. Its rugged construction meant it could survive the intense anti-aircraft fire that ground attack missions encountered. Its 8.50 caliber machine guns could destroy soft-skinned vehicles and damage armored vehicles, and it could carry bombs and rockets, multiplying its destructive capability. The transition from pure fighter to fighter-bomber began in late 1943. Early P-47Ds were modified with bomb shackles under the fuselage, allowing them to carry a single 500-pound bomb. The next step was adding wing racks for 2 more 500-pound bombs, giving the P-47 a 1,500-pound bomb load. Later models could carry 2,500 pounds of bombs or 10 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets.
First Lieutenant Les Bowes of the 365th flew 107 combat missions and remembered the ground attack missions vividly. He recalled one mission where his flight leader's P-47
took a direct hit from 88mm flak. The entire left wing was blown off. The P-47 went into a flat spin and crashed. The pilot's last words over the radio, "Tell my wife goodbye." But Bose's faith in the P-47 never wavered. He survived 4 aircraft destroyed or badly damaged, all named Blonde Trouble. Each time the rugged P-47 absorbed damage that would have destroyed other fighters and brought him back to base. The 9th Air Force, which operated primarily in the ground attack role, flew over 500,000 sorties with P-47s. Their losses to all causes were about 2,000 aircraft. The loss rate of 0.4% per sortie was remarkably low for such dangerous missions. German ground forces learned to fear the P-47. They called it Jabo, short for Jagdbomber, fighter bomber. When they heard the distinctive sound of R-2800 engines, experienced soldiers dove for cover. They knew that within seconds, bombs would be falling and .50 caliber rounds would be tearing through vehicles. Wehrmacht situation reports from mid-1944 onward consistently mentioned American fighter-bomber attacks as a critical problem. Supply convoys could only move at night. Troop movements were restricted to darkness or bad weather. Daylight movement meant instant attack by P-47s that appeared without warning. The interdiction campaign against German railroads was particularly effective. P-47s would patrol known rail lines, looking for moving trains. When they spotted one, they'd attack the locomotive first, destroying or disabling it. Then they'd work back along the train, bombing and strafing each car methodically. Pilots developed a technique called skip bombing for railroad tunnels. German trains would hide in tunnels during the day, emerging only at night. P-47 pilots would approach the tunnel at high speed and very low altitude, release their bombs just before reaching the tunnel mouth, and the bombs would skip along the ground like stones on water, bouncing into the tunnel and exploding. The psychological impact on German forces was immense. They could hear the P-47s, but often couldn't see them until it was too late. The aircraft would appear out of the sun or from behind terrain features, attack before the Germans could react, and disappear before anti-aircraft fire could respond effectively. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, German commander in the West, wrote in a report that American fighter bombers were making large-scale troop movements impossible during daylight. He stated that the mobility advantage Germany had relied on throughout the war had been lost to Allied air superiority. Ground attack was exhausting and dangerous work. Pilots would fly 2 or 3 missions daily, each mission lasting 2 to 3 hours. Between missions, they'd eat, attend briefings, and try to rest. Then they'd climb back into the cockpit and do it again. The 365th Fighter Group, the Hellhawks, epitomized the ground attack role. Operating from crude airstrips in France and Belgium, they lived in tents, endured terrible weather, and flew constant missions supporting advancing ground forces. Their motto could have been, "Any mission, anywhere, anytime." Mexican pilots of the 201st Fighter Squadron flew P-47s in the Pacific, conducting ground attack missions in the Philippines. In 791 sorties, they lost no pilots to enemy action, a testament to both the P-47's survivability and the pilot's skill. Brazilian pilots of the 1st Fighter Squadron flew P-47s in Italy, conducting 445 missions. They lost 15 aircraft to ground fire, but proved that the Thunderbolt could operate effectively in mountainous terrain where other fighters struggled. The ground attack mission pushed the P-47 to its limits. Low altitude meant engines ran hot. Maneuvering to attack and avoid ground fire stressed the airframe. Impact from ground fire created damage that had to be repaired between missions. But the aircraft held up. Maintenance crews worked miracles keeping war-weary P-47s operational, replacing battle-damaged parts and patching holes. By war's end, the P-47 had become the most effective ground attack aircraft in the European theater. It wasn't designed for the role. It was designed as a high-altitude escort fighter. But American pragmatism recognized the robust airframe, powerful engine, and devastating firepower could be applied to ground targets with tremendous effect. German ground forces that survived the war spoke with bitter respect about American air power. They'd watch P-47s work over a target and know that whatever was being attacked would cease to exist. The combination of bombs, rockets, and 8 .50 caliber machine guns delivered destruction that German ground forces simply couldn't withstand. The fighter-bomber role transformed the P-47 from an important but limited escort fighter into a war-winning weapon system. It could fight for air superiority, escort bombers deep into Germany, and destroy ground targets with equal effectiveness. Few aircraft in history have proven so adaptable and so deadly across multiple mission profiles. The defining characteristic of the P-47 Thunderbolt was survivability. Time and again, P-47s absorbed damage that would have destroyed other aircraft and brought their pilots home safely. This wasn't luck. It was the result of deliberate design decisions that prioritized pilot survival over raw performance. The key was the radial engine. The Pratt Whitney R-2800 double wasp had 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows around the crankshaft. This configuration provided redundancy. A cylinder could be shot away and the engine would keep running on the remaining 17 cylinders. Multiple cylinders could be damaged and the engine would still produce enough power to fly.
Pilots needed training for the ground attack role. Air combat was three-dimensional, fought at high altitude where targets were small and moving fast. Ground attack was two-dimensional, fought at treetop level where targets were stationary or slow-moving but defended by massed anti-aircraft fire. The approach was typically a 30-degree dive from around 5,000 feet. The pilot would roll inverted, pull the nose down to point at the target, then roll upright in the dive. Airspeed would build rapidly. At 2,000 feet, the pilot would center the gun sight pipper on the target and release bombs or fire rockets. Then immediate pullout, hugging the terrain to avoid anti-aircraft fire. Strafing runs were more dangerous. The pilot would approach at high speed and low altitude, often below 100 feet. When the target came into range, he'd fire all 8.50 caliber guns, sending 800 rounds per minute streaking toward the target. The massed fire could destroy trucks, locomotives, and aircraft on the ground. Then the P-47 would pull up and away, often taking ground fire during the entire attack. The danger from anti-aircraft fire was significant. German flat guns ranged from 20mm rapid-fire weapons to 88mm heavy guns. The 20mm and 37mm guns were the real killers at low altitude. They fired fast enough to put multiple shells in the air, creating a lethal envelope around likely attack routes. P-47 pilots developed tactics to survive. Never attack the same target twice. Never follow a predictable flight path. Vary altitude and speed constantly. If you see tracers, brake immediately, because for every tracer you see, there are 4 regular rounds you don't see. Stay low and fast after the attack. Don't climb until well clear of the target area. Despite the danger, ground attack proved incredibly effective. A single P-47 with 8.50 caliber guns and 2,500 pounds of bombs could destroy entire convoys. 4 P-47s working as a flight could devastate a marshalling yard, destroying dozens of railroad cars and locomotives. The statistics from D-Day forward are staggering. Between June 6, 1944 and May 8, 1945, P-47s claimed destruction of 86,000 railroad cars, 9,000 locomotives, 68,000 trucks, and 6,000 armored vehicles. These weren't exaggerated claims. Ground forces advancing through France found the evidence: vast graveyards of destroyed equipment lining the roads.
Operation Cobra in July 1944 showed what concentrated air power could achieve. The operation was designed to break out from the Normandy beachhead by punching through German defensive lines. On July 29th, in the vicinity of Rancy, the 405th Fighter Group attacked a German column trapped by American armored forces. The attack lasted from 3:10 p.m. until 9:40 p.m. Waves of P-47s hit the column repeatedly, bombing and strafing. The Germans couldn't move forward, couldn't retreat, couldn't disperse. They could only huddle in their vehicles or hide in ditches while American fighters methodically destroyed them. Ground investigation after the battle found 66 tanks, 204 vehicles, and 11 guns destroyed in that single attack. The German column ceased to exist as a fighting force. The breakthrough succeeded, and American forces poured through the gap in the German lines. During the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, weather initially grounded Allied aircraft. German forces advanced under cloud cover, making significant gains, but when the weather cleared on December 23rd, the P-47s came out in force. The Hellhawks, the 365th Fighter Group, flew constant missions over the Ardennes. They bombed German tank columns, strafed troop concentrations, destroyed supply trucks. German forces that had been advancing rapidly found themselves under constant air attack. Movement during daylight became impossible. Tanks and vehicles sat immobile, waiting for darkness before daring to move. Contrast this with liquid-cooled inline engines, like the Merlin and the P-51 or the DB-601 and the BF-109. Those engines had coolant systems with radiators, pumps, and lines carrying coolant throughout the engine. A single hit on the cooling system would cause the engine to overheat and seize within minutes. The pilot had to bail out or attempt an emergency landing. The R-2800 had no vulnerable cooling system. It was air-cooled, relying on ram air flowing through the cooling fins on each cylinder. Shoot off a cylinder, and that cylinder stopped producing power, but it didn't affect the other cylinders. The engine would run rough, but it would run. Multiple accounts describe P-47s returning to base with one or more cylinders completely shot away, the engine vibrating violently, but still producing enough power for controlled flight. Mechanics would inspect the damage and shake their heads in amazement that the pilot had made it back. Captain Robert Johnson's famous survival on June 26, 1943, demonstrated the R-2800's toughness. His engine took multiple 20mm hits, but kept running. He flew over 60 miles of ocean with a damaged engine that should have quit. The radial configuration's inherent damage tolerance saved his life. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabreski had a similar experience. His turbocharger was hit by 20mm cannon fire. The hit so hard it felt like the aircraft had exploded. The engine lost power immediately, but Gabreski was able to restart the engine at lower altitude where the turbocharger wasn't needed, and he flew home on reduced power. The armor protection was another survivability factor. The P-47 had thick armor plate behind the pilot's seat and head, protecting from rear attacks. Armored glass in the windscreen could stop small arms fire. Armor around vital components like the oil cooler and turbocharger provided protection from ground fire. Self-sealing fuel tanks were critical. When punctured, the rubber lining would swell and seal the hole, preventing fuel loss and reducing fire risk. P-47s with multiple fuel tank punctures would land safely, the self-sealing tanks having done their job. The airframe itself was built heavy. Thick aluminum skin, robust internal structures, over-engineered attachments and fittings. This added weight, which hurt performance, but it meant the aircraft could absorb battle damage without structural failure.
Stories of P-47 survivability became legendary. One P-47 returned to base with over 400 documented hits from machine gun and cannon fire. The aircraft looked like Swiss cheese, but the pilot walked away unhurt. Another P-47 had its entire tail surface shot away by flak. The pilot maintained control using asymmetric thrust and made a successful emergency landing. The aircraft was written off, but the pilot survived. A third P-47 collided mid-air with a German fighter. The collision tore off 3 feet of the P-47's right wing. The pilot wrestled the asymmetric aircraft back to base and landed. The German fighter disintegrated and its pilot was killed. German pilots who encountered P-47s quickly learned that bringing one down required sustained accurate fire. A few hits wouldn't do it. The aircraft had to be thoroughly destroyed or set on fire. Otherwise, it would limp away and make it back to England. Luftwaffe ace Heinz Baer said it best. The P-47 could absorb an astounding amount of lead. He noted that multiple cannon hits that would destroy a Bf-109 or FW-190 would just damage a P-47. To reliably shoot down a Thunderbolt, you needed to set it on fire or destroy the pilot. This had strategic implications. German pilots, knowing they needed extended firing opportunities to destroy P-47s, had to take greater risks. They had to close to point-blank range or make multiple passes. Both options exposed them to return fire from the P-47's 8.50 caliber guns. The result was that German pilots often broke off attacks early, not wanting to risk extended engagement with an aircraft that was so hard to kill. This allowed P-47s to continue their missions even when damaged, knowing that German pilots might not press their advantage. Pilots trusted the P-47 absolutely. They flew aggressive tactics because they knew the aircraft would bring them home even if hit. That confidence translated into combat effectiveness. A pilot who's worried about getting hit flies cautiously. A pilot who trusts his aircraft to survive damage flies aggressively. The top 10 American aces who flew the P-47 all survived the war. This wasn't a coincidence. The aircraft's survivability meant ace pilots who flew more missions and took more risks than average pilots survived longer and accumulated higher victory scores. Many pilots said they preferred the P-47 specifically because of its survivability. Yes, the P-51 Mustang had longer range. Yes, the Spitfire was more nimble. But if you got hit, if something went wrong, the P-47 would bring you home. That knowledge was worth more than any performance advantage. Colonel Hub Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, refused to transition to P-51s even when ordered. He wanted his pilots flying P-47s because he trusted the aircraft's ability to keep them alive. The 56th remained the only 8th Air Force Fighter Group flying P-47s until the end of the war, and they had one of the highest pilot survival rates of any fighter group. The maintenance perspective reinforced the survivability story. Crew chiefs worked on P-47s that came back from missions with massive damage. They'd patch holes, replace damaged components, and have the aircraft ready for the next mission. The robust construction meant battle-damaged aircraft could be repaired quickly and returned to service. One crew chief reported working on a P-47 that had taken a direct flak hit in the wing. The explosion had created a hole large enough to crawl through, but the wing spar was intact and the aircraft had landed safely. They patched the hole with aluminum sheet, riveted it in place, and the aircraft flew its next mission 2 days later. The ability to absorb damage and continue fighting was more than just a nice feature. It was a force multiplier. P-47 units maintained higher operational readiness because damaged aircraft could be repaired rather than written off. Pilots flew more aggressively because they trusted their aircraft. And the psychological impact on German pilots watching P-47s survive hits that should have been fatal was significant. General George Patton, whose Third Army advanced across France in 1944 with P-47 support, said the aircraft deserved as much credit for defeating Germany as any ground unit. He'd seen firsthand how difficult it was to stop P-47s, both in the air and in the ground attack role. The combination of firepower, performance, and survivability made the Thunderbolt a weapon the Germans couldn't counter. By war's end, the P-47's reputation for toughness was unmatched. It was the aircraft you wanted to be flying when everything went wrong. It was the aircraft that would take a beating and keep flying. It was the aircraft that brought pilots home. The P-47 Thunderbolt produced some of the most successful fighter pilots in American history. Their stories illustrate not just individual skill, but the capabilities of the aircraft they flew. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Samuel Johnson ended the war with 27 confirmed victories, making him the second highest-scoring American ace in Europe. Johnson flew 91 combat missions between April 1943 and May 1944, all in P-47s with the 56th Fighter Group. Johnson was an unlikely ace. He'd failed gunnery school during training, never managing to achieve the minimum qualifying score shooting at towed targets. Yet in combat, he proved to be a devastating marksman. His secret was patience. He'd wait for the perfect shot, close to 300 yards or less, then fire a short burst. His gun camera footage shows remarkable accuracy, bullets converging precisely on target. Johnson's combat record is impressive beyond the victory count. He participated in 91 missions and encountered German fighters 43 times. In 36 of those encounters, he fired his guns. In those 36 engagements, he hit 37 German aircraft and destroyed at least 27, possibly as many as 32, according to post-war German records. His most famous mission, surviving the attack by Oberleutnant Egon Mayer on June 26, 1943, has been recounted earlier. But Johnson had many close calls. On October 10, 1943, he shot down a Bf-110 and an FW-190 in the same engagement, but took severe battle damage himself. His P-47 had 5 direct 20mm cannon hits in the right wing. Any one of those hits could have been fatal. The aircraft held together and he landed safely. Johnson became an ace on October 10, 1943, shooting down his 5th German aircraft. By December, he had 10 victories. By March 1944, he had 21. On May 8, 1944, his last combat mission, he scored 2 more victories, breaking Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record of 26 kills. After completing his combat tour, Johnson returned to the United States for a war bond tour. He met Richard, or Dick Bong, America's top Pacific ace with 40 victories. The two became friends, 2 pilots who'd achieved remarkable success in different theaters. After the war, Johnson worked for Republic Aviation, the company that built the P-47. His first assignment was redesigning the cockpit layout to improve instrument visibility. He spent 18 years with Republic Aviation before transitioning to the insurance industry. Johnson credited the P-47 for his survival and success. In interviews, he repeatedly emphasized that the aircraft's toughness saved his life multiple times. He said no other fighter could have survived the punishment his P-47s absorbed. Johnson died on December 27, 1998, at age 78. Until his death, he remained an advocate for recognizing the P-47's contribution to victory in Europe.
Colonel Francis Stanley "Gabby" Gabreski was America's top-scoring ace in Europe with 28 confirmed victories. Gabreski flew with the 56th Fighter Group, eventually becoming commander of the 61st Fighter Squadron. Gabreski's path to becoming an ace was unusual. He'd nearly washed out of flight training in 1941, struggling with the academic requirements. He persevered and received his wings, but his early career showed no indication of future greatness. He arrived in England in early 1943 and flew his first combat missions in P-47s in April. His first victory came on August 24, 1943, shooting down an FW-190. More victories followed steadily. By November 1943, he was an ace. By February 1944, he had 15 victories. Gabreski's flying style was aggressive but calculated. He used the P-47's strengths ruthlessly. He'd position himself at altitude, dive on German formations, destroy his target, and zoom back to safety. He rarely engaged in prolonged dogfights, understanding that the P-47's energy tactics were superior to turning combat. On July 20, 1944,
Gabreski's luck ran out. He was strafing a German airfield when his propeller struck the ground, damaging the engine. He attempted to climb away, but the engine quit. He crash-landed and was captured, spending the rest of the war in Stalag Luft 1. Despite being a prisoner for 10 months, Gabreski survived the war and returned to military service. In Korea, flying F-86 Sabres, he shot down 6 more aircraft, bringing his career total to 34.5 victories. He became one of only 7 American pilots to achieve ace status in 2 wars. Gabreski flew 266 combat missions total in World War II, an extraordinary number that exposed him to tremendous risk. His survival speaks to both his skill and the P-47's ability to bring pilots home. After Korea, Gabreski continued in the Air Force, eventually retiring as a colonel. He died on January 31, 2002, at age 82. Like Johnson, he always credited the P-47 for his success and survival. Colonel Hubert Zemke commanded the 56th Fighter Group and later the 497th Fighter Group. While his personal victory count of 17.75 aerial victories was lower than Johnson's or Gabreski's, his impact on fighter tactics and leadership was immeasurable. Zemke understood the P-47's capabilities before his pilots did. He developed the boom and zoom tactics that became standard for all P-47 units. He drilled his pilots relentlessly on energy management, altitude advantage, and disciplined attacks. His tactical innovations directly contributed to the 56th Fighter Group's success. The 56th, nicknamed Zemke's Wolfpack, became the highest-scoring fighter group in the 8th Air Force with over 1,000 aerial victories. Zemke's leadership was the foundation of that success. Zemke was shot down on October 30, 1944, not by enemy fighters, but by bad weather. His P-47 broke apart in a thunderstorm, and he parachuted into Germany, spending the rest of the war as a POW. After the war, Zemke continued in the Air Force, eventually retiring as a colonel. He wrote extensively about fighter tactics and leadership. He died in 1994 at age 80. Lieutenant Colonel Walker Bud Maharan scored 20.75 victories flying P-47s with the 56th Fighter Group. Maharan was known for aggressive tactics and superb marksmanship. He would close to point-blank range before firing, ensuring hits with every burst. Maharan was shot down over France on March 27, 1944, but evaded capture with help from the French resistance. He made it back to England after several weeks behind enemy lines. After returning to duty, Maharan transitioned to P-51 Mustangs and added 3.5 more victories. In Korea, he flew F-86 Sabres and added another 3.5 victories, becoming another pilot to achieve ace status in 2 wars. Captain Gerald Jerry Johnson, no relation to Robert Johnson, scored 16.5 victories with the 56th Fighter Group. Johnson was a natural pilot with excellent situational awareness. He could track multiple bogies simultaneously while managing his own aircraft. He survived the war and continued flying. He died in 1990, another P-47 ace who credited the aircraft for his survival and success.
The aces represent the pinnacle of P-47 effectiveness, but thousands of pilots flew the Thunderbolt in combat. Many scored 1 or 2 victories. Some never encountered enemy aircraft, but all of them contributed to air superiority over Europe. The average P-47 pilot flew approximately 50 combat missions. Many flew 100 or more. The 8th Air Force rotated pilots home after completing their combat tour, typically 25 to 50 missions, depending on the time period. Some pilots, like Gabreski and Johnson, extended their tours to continue fighting. The sense of mission was strong. These pilots understood they were fighting to destroy Nazism and free Europe. They saw the bombers they escorted striking targets that would shorten the war. They saw the ground forces they supported liberating towns and villages. The connection between their missions and ultimate victory was clear. And they trusted the P-47. Absolutely. When you strapped into a Thunderbolt, you knew you were flying one of the toughest fighters ever built. You knew those 8 .50 caliber guns would destroy anything you got in your sights.
You knew the powerful engine would get you home, even if damaged. That knowledge gave pilots confidence to fly aggressively and take the fight to the enemy. The ace pilot stories are inspiring, but the real story is the collective achievement of thousands of P-47 pilots who flew, fought, and often died doing their duty. They broke the Luftwaffe's back. They protected the bombers that destroyed German industry. They attacked ground targets that disrupted German military operations. And they did it in an aircraft that German pilots had initially laughed at. By late 1944, the laughter had stopped. German pilots who survived encounters with P-47s came back with respect and caution. They'd learned that the bulky American fighter was deadly in capable hands. They'd watched their comrades get shot down by devastating .50 caliber fire. They'd tried to shoot down P-47s and watched their cannon shells hit home without bringing the aircraft down. The German perspective on the P-47 evolved from mockery to respect to fear over the course of 18 months. Understanding that evolution reveals much about the aircraft's impact on air war over Europe. Initially, German fighter pilots were dismissive. The P-47 was too big, too heavy, too ungainly. It looked like a mistake. Werner Schroer's April 1943 radio call describing P-47s as barrels captured the German attitude perfectly. But first combat encounters forced reassessment. German pilots discovered the P-47 was fast in a dive, faster than anything they flew. They discovered its firepower was overwhelming, and they discovered it could survive damage that would destroy their own aircraft. By late 1943, tactical guidance from Luftwaffe Command recognized the P-47 as a serious threat. Pilots were instructed to avoid prolonged engagement at high altitude. They were told to break away if P-47s dove on them from above. They were warned that the P-47's 8.50 caliber guns required only a 1 or 2 second burst to destroy an aircraft. German test pilots evaluated a captured P-47 that had made an emergency landing in November 1943. Lieutenant William Roach of the 355th Fighter Group had gotten lost in bad weather and landed at what he thought was an English base. It was German. The Germans repaired Roach's P-47 and put it through extensive testing. Their report acknowledged the aircraft's strengths: excellent high-altitude performance, devastating firepower, robust construction. They noted weaknesses: poor low-altitude climb rate, heavy controls at high speed, and large size making it an easy target. But the overall conclusion was concerning for German commanders. The P-47 represented a different approach to fighter design, one that prioritized survivability and firepower over agility. And in actual combat, that approach was proving effective. German aces who encountered P-47s regularly spoke with grudging respect. Major Heinz Baer, with 220 victories, said the P-47 had to be handled very carefully. He noted that attacking from behind was dangerous because the armor protection and robust construction made it difficult to achieve a kill before the P-47 could turn the tables. Major Josef Priller, with 101 victories, went further. He called the P-47 the perfect fighter-bomber in post-war interviews. He noted its guns never jammed, its engine never quit, and it could absorb more punishment than any German fighter. These weren't casual observations. These were assessments from expert pilots who'd been fighting since 1939 or 1940. They understood fighter aircraft intimately, and they recognized that the P-47 represented a new paradigm they couldn't match. The industrial aspect troubled German observers. America was producing 600 P-47s monthly by mid-1944. Germany's entire fighter production was about 1,000 aircraft monthly across all types. And American fighters kept getting better while German fighters stayed static or declined in quality as experienced workers were drafted and replaced with forced labor. Field reports from German fighter units in 1944 consistently mentioned the P-47 as a primary concern. One report from Jagdgeschwader 3 noted that P-47s could maintain air superiority through sheer numbers and aggressive tactics.
Another report from Jagdgeschwader 26 stated that engaging P-47 formations at high altitude was tactically inadvisable due to the American aircraft's performance advantage. By the time of D-Day, German fighter strength over Western Europe had been shattered. The Luftwaffe could no longer contest Allied air superiority. When German fighters did appear, they were quickly engaged and often destroyed by waiting American fighters, many of them P-47s.
The P-47 represented American industrial might in physical form. Each aircraft required 10,000 man-hours to build. The Pratt Whitney R-2800 engine alone took 1,200 man-hours to manufacture. 8.50 caliber machine guns required another 800 man-hours. American industry was producing these complex machines at rates Germany couldn't match. And America was doing it while also producing B-17 bombers, B-24 bombers, P-51 fighters, P-38 fighters, tanks, trucks, ships, and every other weapon of war. German industry, by 1944, was struggling to produce enough of anything. Allied bombing had disrupted production, raw materials were scarce, experienced workers had been conscripted. From the German perspective, the P-47 wasn't just a fighter aircraft. It was a symbol of why Germany was losing the war. They'd started the war with technological advantages and experienced military forces, but America's industrial capacity overwhelmed those advantages. By 1944, Germany was being buried under an avalanche of American equipment, and the P-47 was part of that avalanche. The irony wasn't lost on German veterans. They'd spent years perfecting lightweight, agile fighters like the Bf-109. They'd emphasized quality over quantity, but in total war, quantity became quality. 10 P-47s might each be inferior to a Bf-109 in a turning dogfight, but 10 P-47s attacking together using boom and zoom tactics would destroy any Bf-109 formation. The evolutionary path from German mockery in April 1943 to German respect by late 1944 reflected broader changes in the war. Germany had entered the war with advantages in training, tactics, and experience, but those advantages eroded over time. Meanwhile, America's advantages in industry, resources, and numbers only grew stronger. The P-47 was the physical embodiment of those American advantages. It was big because America could afford to make it big. It was heavily armed because America could afford the weight penalty. It was ruggedly built because America valued pilot survival over maximum performance. And there were enough P-47s to achieve air superiority because American factories could produce them in quantity. German pilots who survived the war carried those lessons forward. They understood that technological sophistication wasn't enough. They understood that pilot skill wasn't enough. In modern war, industrial capacity and logistical sustainability mattered as much as battlefield performance. And in those categories, America's P-47 had proven decisively superior. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was produced in greater numbers than any other American fighter aircraft, with 15,683 total aircraft manufactured between 1942 and 1945. This achievement alone speaks to its importance, but the numbers only tell part of the story. The Thunderbolt served in every active theater of World War II. In Europe, it formed the backbone of 8th and 9th Air Force fighter operations. In the Mediterranean, it supported the Italian campaign. In the Pacific, it served with the 5th Air Force in the Southwest Pacific campaign. In the China-Burma-India theater, it flew with the 10th Air Force. From March 1943 to August 1945, P-47s flew 546,000 combat sorties. They logged an estimated 1.35 million combat hours. In air-to-air combat, they destroyed 3,752 enemy aircraft, with the loss of 824 P-47s in aerial combat, achieving that impressive 4.6-to-1 kill ratio. But the air-to-air statistics don't capture the P-47's full impact. From D-Day to VE Day alone, P-47s claimed destruction of 86,000 railroad cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored vehicles, and 68,000 trucks. These weren't exaggerated claims. Ground forces advancing through France, Belgium, and Germany found the evidence. The loss rate was remarkably low. Only 0.7% of P-47s dispatched on missions were lost to all causes. This included combat losses, mechanical failures, and operational accidents. By comparison, bomber losses often exceeded 5% per mission. The P-47 served with Allied forces beyond the United States. The Royal Air Force received 830 P-47s, operating them primarily in the China-Burma-India theater. The Soviet Union received 203 P-47s through Lend-Lease, although they made limited use of them. The Free French Air Force operated 446 P-47s. Brazil's 1st Fighter Squadron flew 67 P-47s in the Italian campaign. Mexico's 201st Fighter Squadron flew P-47s in the Philippines. After World War II, the P-47 continued serving with air forces around the world. It saw combat in the Chinese Civil War, the 1947 to 1949 Indo-Pakistani conflict, and various Latin American conflicts. Some nations operated P-47s into the 1960s. The aircraft influenced post-war fighter design despite jet aircraft rendering propeller fighters obsolescent. The lessons learned from P-47 operations, particularly regarding survivability and firepower, influenced the design of subsequent aircraft. The Fairchild Republic A-10 Thunderbolt II, introduced in the 1970s, was deliberately named to honor the P-47. The A-10, like its namesake, prioritizes survivability, heavy firepower, and ground attack effectiveness over speed and agility. The parallel isn't accidental. Designers studying the P-47's combat record recognized that survivability and firepower remained relevant in close air support roles. Individual P-47s have been preserved in museums worldwide. The National Air and Space Museum displays a P-47D at the Udvar Hazy Center. The American Air Museum at Duxford has a beautifully restored P-47. Several P-47s remain airworthy, appearing at air shows and commemorative events. The historical significance extends beyond the aircraft itself to the pilots who flew it. The generation of American pilots who fought in World War II, many of them flying P-47s, represented a unique combination of technical skill, personal courage, and commitment to a cause they believed was just. Robert Johnson's story of survival on June 26, 1943, has been told and retold because it captures something essential about the P-47 experience. One pilot, badly wounded, flying a shot-up aircraft, making it home against all odds. It's a story of American engineering, pilot determination, and the margins that separate life from death in combat. Francis Gabreski's achievement of 28 victories represents the pinnacle of what skilled pilots could accomplish with the P-47. But Gabreski's 266 combat missions tell another story, one of sustained operational effectiveness. Flying that many missions required not just skill, but trust in the aircraft to bring you home. The collective achievement of thousands of P-47 pilots defeated the Luftwaffe over Western Europe. They protected bombers that destroyed German industry. They attacked ground targets that disrupted German military operations. They achieved air superiority that enabled D-Day and the subsequent ground campaign. The strategic impact is difficult to overstate. Without effective fighter escort, strategic bombing would have failed or required unacceptable losses. Without air superiority, D-Day might have failed. Without continuous air attack on German ground forces, the advance through France might have stalled.
The P-47 wasn't the only fighter that contributed to these achievements. The P-51 Mustang, with its longer range, took over long-range escort duties by mid-1944. The P-38 Lightning operated effectively in the Pacific and Mediterranean. The British Spitfire remained a formidable fighter throughout the war. But the P-47 was there first, providing escort when it was desperately needed in 1943, and it remained effective in the ground attack role when other fighters struggled with survivability at low altitude. It was the workhorse, not the glamour girl, of American fighter aviation. Measuring the P-47's contribution requires looking beyond victory counts and loss rates. It requires understanding what air superiority meant for the broader war effort. German forces couldn't move during daylight hours. German industry couldn't operate without being bombed. German fighters couldn't prevent any of it because the P-47 and other Allied fighters controlled the sky. The human cost was real. 5,224 P-47s were lost to all causes during the war. Most of those losses involve pilot deaths or capture. Each loss represented personal tragedy, families receiving telegrams, and futures that would never be realized. But those losses purchased victory, shortened the war, and saved countless lives that would have been lost in a longer conflict. The veterans who flew the P-47 carried their experiences throughout their lives. They'd seen combat in its rawest form. They'd lost friends. They'd faced death repeatedly. Many suffered from what we now know as PTSD, though it wasn't recognized or treated effectively at the time. But they also carried pride in their accomplishments. They'd fought for a just cause and won. They'd flown an aircraft that became legendary for its toughness and effectiveness. They'd contributed to one of the most significant military victories in human history. In the decades after the war,